Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for 24 years, and in that time he had welcomed countless military veterans onto his stage, always treating them with the respect and gratitude their service deserved. But on a humid afternoon in late May 2025, a 68-year-old Vietnam War veteran named Tommy Sullivan would share a story so harrowing, so miraculous, and so emotionally devastating that Steve would literally stand up from his host position, walk across the stage, and embrace this elderly warrior while openly weeping. What began as a standard acknowledgement of military service would transform into one of the most powerful testimonies about war, survival, and the burden of living when others died that had ever been shared on television. Before we continue with Tommy's revelation about the moment he should have died, if you're moved by these authentic stories about veterans' experiences, the psychological weight of surviving combat, and the guilt that haunts those who made it home when their brothers didn't, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories honor the complexity of military service and the lifelong impact of war on those who fight. The Sullivan family from Charleston, South Carolina walked onto the Family Feud stage with a dignity and warmth that immediately endeared them to everyone in the studio. There were 5 of them competing: Tommy, the patriarch at 68, his wife Margaret, who was 66, their son Patrick, who was 43, their daughter-in-law Sarah, who was 41, and their grandson Michael, who was 19 and wearing his Army dress uniform. The presence of 2 veterans, separated by 2 generations, created immediate interest and respect from the audience. Tommy moved with the slight stiffness of age and old injuries, but he stood straight-backed with military bearing that decades of civilian life hadn't erased. He wore a Navy veteran baseball cap and a jacket with various unit patches, and around his neck hung dog tags that he touched periodically as though reminding himself of something important. During the family introductions, Steve immediately noticed and acknowledged the 2 veterans in the family. He started with Michael, the young soldier. "Young man, thank you for your service. How long have you been in the Army?" Michael, standing at attention despite being on a game show, responded with crisp military bearing. "3 years, sir. I just returned from my 2nd deployment to the Middle East." Steve thanked him warmly, then turned to Tommy. "And sir, I see you're a veteran as well." "Which branch did you serve in?" Tommy's weathered face showed both pride and something deeper, something heavier. "United States Navy, sir. I served from 1974 to 1978, including 2 tours in Vietnam as a riverboat sailor. I was part of the Mobile Riverine Force in the Mekong Delta." Steve's expression immediately shifted to something more reverent. "Vietnam. That was a difficult war, a difficult time. Thank you for your service, sir, and welcome home." The audience applauded respectfully, and Tommy nodded his acknowledgement, but Steve noticed tears forming in the elderly veteran's eyes at those words, "welcome home." The game proceeded with both families displaying good humor and competitive spirit. The Sullivan family was playing against the Chen family from California, and the energy was positive despite the competitive nature of the show. But throughout the game, Steve kept noticing Tommy's emotional responses to certain moments. When a question about things that keep you up at night came up, Tommy's expression darkened noticeably. When another question asked about a sound that might startle you, Tommy's hand unconsciously went to his dog tags. Steve, always perceptive about his contestants' emotional states, recognized trauma responses when he saw them. The Sullivan family won their game decisively and advanced to fast money. During the brief break before the final round, Steve noticed Tommy standing slightly apart from his family, staring at his dog tags with an expression of profound sadness. Steve approached him quietly. "Mr. Sullivan, sir, are you all right? You seem like you're carrying something heavy today." Tommy looked up at Steve with eyes that held decades of pain, and what he said next would change the entire tone of the show. "Mr. Harvey, these dog tags aren't mine. They belong to my best friend, Dennis McCarthy. He died in my arms on April 14, 1975, during the Fall of Saigon. Today is May 28th. Next week, June 4th, would have been Dennis's 70th birthday. I've been thinking about him all day, about how he should be here celebrating with his family, how he should have got to live the life I've lived. And I'm thinking about the moment when I should have died instead of him, the moment that changed everything." Steve stood very still, recognizing immediately that he was about to hear something significant. Would you be willing to share that story? I understand if it's too personal, but if you're comfortable sharing, I think people need to hear what veterans carry." Tommy looked at his family, and Margaret nodded encouragingly. Patrick and Sarah both looked emotional, clearly knowing the story their father was about to share. Michael, the young soldier, stood at attention with tears already forming in his eyes. When they resumed taping for Fast Money, Steve made an unusual decision. Instead of immediately jumping into the rapid-fire questions, he addressed the audience and cameras. Before we continue with Fast Money, Mr. Sullivan has something he'd like to share. This is a veteran who has been carrying a story for 50 years and he's ready to tell it. I think we all need to listen. The studio fell completely silent, and Tommy, standing at the Fast Money podium, began to speak. April 14, 1975. Saigon was falling. We all knew it was coming, but the speed of the collapse caught everyone off guard. I was 23 years old, stationed on a riverboat that was being used to evacuate people from areas around Saigon. It was absolute chaos. Rockets coming in, gunfire everywhere, thousands of people desperate to escape before the North Vietnamese arrived. Our boat was overloaded with refugees, way beyond safe capacity, but we couldn't turn people away. Women, children, elderly people, all of them terrified. Tommy's voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the podium tightly. My best friend Dennis McCarthy was from Boston. We'd gone through training together, served 2 tours together. We were like brothers. That morning, Dennis and I were both supposed to be evacuating refugees from a village about 30 miles outside Saigon. But at the last minute, our commander changed the assignment. He told Dennis to take the boat run to the village, and he told me to stay back and help coordinate the evacuation at our base location. The studio remained absolutely silent, everyone sensing the weight of what was coming. Tommy continued, I was angry about the change. Dennis and I always ran missions together. We had a system, we trusted each other completely, and I didn't want to be separated. I actually argued with our commander, which you didn't do in the military, but I had a bad feeling about Dennis going out without me. The commander told me to follow orders and stay at base. Dennis told me he'd be fine, that he'd be back in a few hours, that we'd evacuate together when he returned. Tommy paused, his voice breaking slightly. Dennis's boat never made it to that village. About an hour into the mission, they were hit by rocket fire. The boat took a direct hit and started sinking. Dennis was critically wounded, shrapnel through his abdomen and chest. The other crew members who survived the initial hit managed to get the boat to shore and called for medevac, but it was chaos that day. Every helicopter was busy with evacuations. By the time they got Dennis to a field hospital, it was too late. He died from his injuries about 6 hours after the attack. Tommy's tears were flowing freely now, and Steve Harvey stood frozen, his own eyes glistening. The audience was completely silent except for quiet crying. Tommy continued with the devastating revelation. Here's what I learned years later, information that was declassified in the 90s. That mission, the one Dennis took because I was ordered to stay back, wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. There was intelligence suggesting that route was compromised, that enemy forces were targeting river traffic in that area. Our commander knew it was dangerous. He made the decision about who to send based on who had family waiting back home. The implication hung in the air for a moment before Tommy made it explicit. Dennis was engaged to be married. His fiancée, Karen, was waiting for him in Boston. They were planning to get married 3 months after he came home. He talked about her constantly, showed everyone pictures, counted down the days until he'd see her again. I was single, no girlfriend, no fiancée. Our commander made a calculation. If one of us had to take that dangerous run, better to send the single guy than the one with a woman waiting to marry him. Steve's hand went to his mouth in shock at this revelation. Tommy pressed on, but at the last minute, the commander changed his mind. He told me later, years later, when we reconnected, that he looked at Dennis and saw someone so full of hope and plans for the future that he couldn't send him on what might be a death mission. So he sent Dennis instead, thinking maybe the universe would protect someone who had so much to live for. He made the wrong call. Dennis died because our commander tried to play God and decide whose life was worth more. The weight of survivor's guilt in Tommy's voice was almost unbearable to witness. For 50 years, I have lived with the knowledge that Dennis died in my place. That mission was supposed to be mine. That boat, that route, that rocket, all of it should have been me. Instead, Dennis took my death and I got to live his life. I came home. I met my beautiful wife, Margaret, 6 months after returning from Vietnam. I had a career, children, grandchildren. I've had 50 years of life that Dennis never got. And every single day, I think about Karen, his fiancée, and how her life was destroyed because our commander sent the wrong man on that mission. Steve Harvey could not remain in his hosting position. He walked directly to Tommy, and in a moment that would become iconic, Steve simply wrapped his arms around this elderly veteran and held him while Tommy sobbed. The audience rose to their feet, not in applause but in solidarity and grief, witnessing this warrior finally releasing decades of pain. Margaret rushed to join them, embracing her husband from the other side, and Patrick and Sarah came as well, surrounding Tommy with family love while he broke down completely. When Tommy finally composed himself enough to continue, Steve kept his hand on the veteran's shoulder, no longer concerned with game show protocol or format. This was about honoring a story that needed to be told. Tommy shared the rest of what he'd been carrying. I went to visit Karen, Dennis's fiancée, about 5 years after the war ended. I needed to tell her about his last hours, about how he died, about how brave he was. I needed to tell her that he talked about her at the end, that her name was the last word he spoke. Tommy's voice broke completely. Karen never married. She never had children. She spent the last 50 years living alone, working as a teacher, keeping Dennis's memory alive but never moving on. When I told her that I was the one who was supposed to be on that boat, that Dennis died in my place, do you know what she said to me? The studio waited in silence. She said, Tommy, Dennis loved you like a brother. If he knew that by taking that mission he saved your life, he would have considered it a fair trade. Don't dishonor his sacrifice by wishing you died instead. Honor it by living well. Tommy looked directly at the cameras, his face ravaged by tears but his voice strong with conviction. But how do you live well when you know someone died in your place? How do you enjoy your children's laughter without thinking about the children Dennis never had? How do you celebrate anniversaries without remembering that Karen and Dennis never got to have a wedding day? How do you watch your grandson? He gestured to Michael in his army uniform. Serve in the military without being terrified that the universe is going to correct its mistake and take someone else I love. Michael, the young soldier, was openly weeping, clearly understanding for the first time the full weight his grandfather had been carrying. Tommy addressed him directly. Michael, when you enlisted, I was proud and terrified in equal measure. Proud because you wanted to serve, terrified because I know what war really costs. And it doesn't just cost the people who die. It costs the people who survive and have to live with the question of why them and not me. Steve Harvey, tears streaming down his face, found his voice. Mr. Sullivan, Tommy, sir, I need to tell you something, and I need everyone watching to hear this. What you're describing is called survivor's guilt, and it's a burden that countless veterans carry. You did not cause Dennis's death. A commander made a decision. A rocket was fired by an enemy combatant. A war that should never have happened took a young man's life. None of that is on you. Steve continued, his voice passionate and breaking with emotion. You have spent 50 years punishing yourself for surviving, feeling like you don't deserve the life you've lived, carrying the weight of Dennis's death like it was your responsibility. But Karen was right. Dennis would want you to live well. He would want you to love your wife, raise your children, celebrate your grandson's service, and find peace. You don't honor his memory by destroying yourself with guilt. You honor it by living the fullest life possible and telling his story so he's not forgotten. Tommy nodded, accepting Steve's words but also speaking his deeper truth. I understand that intellectually, Mr. Harvey, but in my heart, in my soul, I still feel like I'm living on borrowed time. Every good moment in my life is shadowed by the knowledge that Dennis should have had those moments instead. When Margaret and I celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, all I could think about was that Karen and Dennis should have been celebrating their 50th anniversary too. When my son Patrick was born, I thought about the children Dennis never had. When my grandson Michael was born, I thought about grandchildren Dennis will never meet. I've lived an entire lifetime in Dennis's place, and the weight of that is crushing. Margaret, Tommy's wife of 50 years, spoke up for the first time, her voice thick with emotion. I've watched my husband carry this burden for our entire marriage. When we first met, he told me about Dennis within days of us dating. He wanted me to know that he felt like he was living a life that wasn't meant to be his, that he didn't fully deserve happiness because his friend died in his place. I told him then, and I've told him 1,000 times since. The fact that you survived doesn't diminish Dennis's sacrifice. It magnifies it. He died so you could live, and you've lived beautifully. You've been an amazing husband, father, and grandfather. You've helped countless other veterans through your work with the VA. You've kept Dennis's memory alive by telling his story. You haven't wasted the life he saved. Patrick, Tommy's son, added his perspective. Growing up, I always knew about Uncle Dennis. That's what Dad called him, even though they weren't related by blood. Dad told me stories about Dennis constantly. About how funny he was, how brave, how much he loved his fiancée, how excited he was to start his life after the war. Because of Dad, Dennis isn't just a name on a memorial wall. He's a real person whose story has been passed down through our family. My kids know about Uncle Dennis. They know that Grandpa carries his dog tags, that we honor him on his birthday, that he's part of our family even though none of us except Dad ever met him. Michael, the young soldier and Tommy's grandson, finally spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. Grandpa, I enlisted because of you and because of Uncle Dennis. You told me his story when I was thinking about joining the army, and you asked me if I understood what I might be asked to sacrifice. You made sure I knew that military service isn't just about honor and courage. It's also about loss and burden, and coming home different than you left, if you come home at all. You prepared me better than any recruiter could because you told me the truth about war. And now that I've served, now that I've lost friends in combat, I understand what you carry in a way I couldn't before. Michael continued, his voice breaking. Grandpa, on my first deployment, my unit lost 2 soldiers. I was supposed to be in the vehicle that hit an IED, but at the last minute the patrol order changed, and I was reassigned to a different vehicle. The 2 guys who took my place in that vehicle died. I've been carrying that guilt for 18 months, feeling like I should have been the one who died. And I never told you because I didn't want to add to your burden. But now, hearing you talk about Uncle Dennis, I realize I'm walking the same path you've walked for 50 years. And I don't want to spend my life the way you've spent yours, punishing myself for surviving. The revelation that Michael was carrying his own survivor's guilt created another wave of emotion in the studio. Tommy looked at his grandson with an expression of profound pain and recognition. Michael, no, I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to know what this feels like. Michael responded, but I do know, Grandpa, and maybe that's why I needed to hear you finally talk about it. Because if you can learn to forgive yourself after 50 years, maybe I can learn after 18 months. Maybe we can help each other. Steve Harvey, witnessing this multi-generational trauma and the possibility of healing, made another unprecedented decision. We're not playing fast money. I don't care about the game right now. This is bigger than a game show. What we're witnessing is a family confronting trauma that has been passed down through generations, and we're going to give them the space and support they need. He turned to address the production booth. Contact every veteran's mental health organization we work with. Get counselors here now. This family needs support, and so does every veteran and military family watching this who sees themselves in this story. During an extended break, mental health professionals who worked with the show on veteran-related issues came to speak with Tommy and Michael. The conversation that followed, which happened mostly off-camera but was later described by participants, involved both men discussing their survivor's guilt in depth for the first time. Tommy learned that Michael had been suffering in silence, afraid to burden his family with his pain. Michael learned the full extent of what his grandfather had been carrying for 5 decades, and both men began the difficult work of understanding that survival isn't something to feel guilty about, even when others didn't survive. When they resumed, Steve addressed the situation with the seriousness it deserved. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed today is 2 veterans, separated by 50 years and multiple wars, carrying the same burden, survivor's guilt. Tommy Sullivan has spent half a century feeling like he should have died instead of his friend Dennis McCarthy. His grandson Michael has spent 18 months feeling like he should have died instead of 2 fellow soldiers. This is what war does to people. It's not just the ones who die who pay the price. It's the ones who survive and have to live with the question of why them and not me. Steve continued, his voice passionate. We need to do better as a society in supporting our veterans with their mental and emotional wounds. Tommy has been carrying this pain for 50 years largely in silence because his generation was taught that men don't talk about feelings, that soldiers especially don't admit to psychological struggle. Michael is part of a generation where we talk more about mental health, but he still felt like he couldn't share his guilt because he didn't want to burden his family. Both of these men have been suffering alone when they should have had support from day one. Steve made an announcement. The Sullivan family isn't going to play fast money today. Instead, we're going to give them the $20,000 anyway because what they've given us today is worth far more than any game. They've given us the truth about the cost of military service. They've shown us that surviving war isn't always the happy ending we want to believe it is. And they've opened up a conversation about survivor's guilt that needs to happen. He continued, additionally, the Steve Harvey Foundation is going to establish a support program specifically for veterans and their families dealing with survivor's guilt and other combat-related trauma. We're going to fund counseling, support groups, and resources to help people like Tommy and Michael get the help they need and deserve. The audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People were crying openly, moved by the raw honesty of what they'd witnessed. Veterans in the audience came forward to embrace Tommy and Michael, sharing their own stories of survivor's guilt and thanking them for speaking openly about something so many carry in silence. When the episode aired 2 months later, during the week leading up to Memorial Day, the response was unprecedented. Within 24 hours, the clip of Tommy revealing the moment he should have died had been viewed over 500 million times globally. Veterans organizations reported that their phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from veterans who had been carrying survivors' guilt in silence and were finally reaching out for help after seeing Tommy and Michael's story. The Department of Veterans Affairs reported a significant increase in veterans seeking mental health services, specifically mentioning survivors' guilt and combat trauma. Counselors noted that many veterans specifically referenced Tommy Sullivan's story as giving them permission to finally address pain they'd been carrying for years or even decades. One VA psychologist commented, "Tommy Sullivan did something extraordinary. He spoke openly about survivors' guilt on national television, showing that this burden is real, that it doesn't diminish with time on its own, and that it's nothing to be ashamed of. He gave countless veterans permission to stop suffering in silence." Karen, Dennis McCarthy's former fiancée who had never married, gave her first interview in 50 years after seeing the episode. Now 73 years old, she spoke about how Dennis's death had shaped her entire life and about her relationship with Tommy over the decades. "Tommy has apologized to me 100 times for surviving when Dennis didn't," Karen shared, tears flowing. "And I've told him 100 times that there's nothing to apologize for. Dennis loved Tommy like a brother. If Dennis had survived and Tommy had died, Dennis would have carried the same guilt Tommy has carried. That's who they were, brothers who would have died for each other." Karen continued, "But I want to say something about survivors' guilt that I've learned over 50 years of living with loss. Feeling guilty for surviving doesn't honor the dead. Living well honors them. Making the world better honors them. Loving the people in your life honors them. Tommy has done all of those things. He's been a wonderful husband, father, and grandfather. He's helped countless veterans through his volunteer work. He's kept Dennis's memory alive by telling his story. That's how you honor someone who died, not by destroying yourself with guilt, but by living a life worthy of the sacrifice they made." Steve Harvey dedicated an entire episode of his talk show to the issues raised by Tommy and Michael's story, featuring veterans from multiple wars, mental health professionals specializing in combat trauma, and family members of veterans struggling with survivors' guilt. The conversation explored why survivors' guilt is so common among combat veterans, how it manifests across different wars and generations, why veterans often suffer in silence, and most importantly, how to help veterans find healing and peace. One particularly powerful segment featured multiple veterans sharing their own moments when they should have died but didn't. A Vietnam veteran described being pulled off a helicopter at the last minute before it was shot down, killing everyone aboard. An Iraq War veteran explained how a malfunction with his weapon kept him out of a patrol where everyone else was killed by an IED. An Afghanistan veteran shared about switching positions with another soldier minutes before a rocket attack that killed the person who took his place. Each story reinforced the same truth. Survivors' guilt is a common burden for combat veterans, and they need support in processing these experiences. Mental health professionals on the show explained the psychology of survivors' guilt. "Humans have a deep need to make sense of random events," one psychologist explained. "When someone survives a situation where others died, especially when the survival seems arbitrary or based on luck rather than anything they did, the brain struggles to process it." Survivors' guilt is often the result of trying to impose order or meaning on chaos. Veterans think, "There must have been a reason I survived and they didn't," and when they can't find a satisfying reason, they conclude that they somehow don't deserve to have survived. The show also addressed how family members can support veterans dealing with survivors' guilt. Margaret Sullivan, Tommy's wife of 50 years, shared her perspective. "For decades, I watched my husband punish himself for surviving. I tried to tell him he deserved happiness, that Dennis's death wasn't his fault, that he was honoring Dennis through the life he lived. But survivor's guilt isn't rational. You can't logic someone out of it. What finally started to help was connecting Tommy with other veterans who understood what he felt, who had their own experiences with survivor's guilt. Talking with people who truly understood made a difference in ways my support alone couldn't." The long-term impact of Tommy's revelation extended far beyond increased awareness of survivors' guilt. Several policy changes emerged in the months following the episode. The VA expanded its mental health services, specifically addressing survivors' guilt and moral injury. Military training programs began incorporating more comprehensive preparation for the psychological challenges of combat, including discussions of survivors' guilt before service members deployed. Peer support programs connecting combat veterans across different wars and eras were established or expanded, recognizing the value of veterans supporting each other through shared understanding. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural conversation about veteran mental health shifted. The stigma that had kept Tommy silent for 50 years and that had made Michael reluctant to share his own guilt began to crack. Veterans and their families started speaking more openly about psychological wounds, and society began to recognize that supporting veterans means more than just thanking them for their service. It means providing comprehensive mental health care, creating space for them to process their experiences without judgment, and understanding that coming home from war is just the beginning of a lifelong journey. 1 year after Tommy's appearance on Family Feud, a follow-up special documented the Sullivan family's journey. Tommy, now 69, shared that he had been participating in a specialized treatment program for combat trauma and survivor's guilt. "I can't say the guilt is gone," Tommy admitted honestly. "I don't know if it ever completely goes away, but it's no longer crushing me. I've learned to live with it rather than being controlled by it. I've learned to honor Dennis's memory not by destroying myself with guilt, but by living the fullest life possible and helping other veterans who are struggling." Michael, now 20, shared that connecting with his grandfather about their shared experiences had been transformative for both of them. "Grandpa and I talk regularly now about what we're both carrying. We've learned that we can support each other in ways other people can't, because we truly understand what the other is feeling. And we've connected with other veterans dealing with survivor's guilt. There's a whole community of us now, supporting each other, reminding each other that survival isn't something to feel guilty about." The special revealed another development. Tommy had finally, after 50 years, returned to Vietnam. He traveled to the area where Dennis had died and held a memorial service at the location. Karen, Dennis's former fiancée, joined him for the trip, and together they honored Dennis's memory and found a measure of closure. "Standing in that place where Dennis took his last breath," Tommy shared, "I finally felt like I could forgive myself for surviving. Not because I don't still wish it had been me, but because I realized that carrying guilt wasn't what Dennis would have wanted for me. He sacrificed so I could live, and the best way to honor that sacrifice is to live well." The special concluded with a powerful moment. Tommy and Michael, the two veterans separated by generations but united by shared trauma, stood together at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. They found Dennis McCarthy's name among the thousands of other names carved into that black granite wall. Tommy placed his hand on Dennis's name and said a prayer of thanks and apology and love. Michael stood beside his grandfather, his hand on Tommy's shoulder, providing support across the generations. And Steve Harvey, who had traveled to D.C. to be with them for this moment, stood witness to the power of finally releasing a burden that had been carried for far too long. If Tommy Sullivan's revelation about the moment he should have died and the 50 years of survivor's guilt he's carried has moved you, deepened your understanding of what veterans experience, or reminded you that the wounds of war are not always visible, please take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with veterans who might be carrying similar burdens, with family members trying to support veterans dealing with combat trauma, and with anyone who needs to understand that supporting our military means providing comprehensive mental health care for the invisible wounds of war. Tommy's courage in finally sharing his story after 5 decades, Michael's willingness to reveal his own struggle, and their family's commitment to healing together has impacted millions of lives and contributed to important conversations about survivors' guilt, combat trauma, and the lifelong cost of military service. Your engagement helps ensure this powerful message reaches more people who desperately need to hear it. The story of 68-year-old Tommy Sullivan revealing that his best friend Dennis McCarthy died in his place during the Fall of Saigon 50 years ago, and the survivor's guilt he's carried every day since, stands as one of the most powerful testimonies about the true cost of war ever shared. His admission that he spent 5 decades feeling like he's living on borrowed time, that every good moment in his life is shadowed by the knowledge that Dennis should have had those moments instead, revealed a truth that countless veterans carry in silence. Survival when others die creates a burden that doesn't diminish with time. Steve Harvey's decision to literally stand up, walk across the stage, and embrace Tommy while both men wept demonstrated that some moments transcend entertainment and require us to simply witness human pain with compassion. Tommy and his grandson Michael, both carrying survivors' guilt from different wars but united in their struggle, showed us that the wounds of war are passed through generations, and that healing requires breaking the silence, seeking support, and learning to forgive ourselves for surviving when others didn't. That is a lesson every society that sends its citizens to war needs to learn. And Tommy's courage in sharing his truth after 50 years of silence has created a path toward healing for countless veterans who finally feel permission to stop suffering alone.